There's a story the chronicles whisper but never dare shout. A story about a princess so captivating, men called her the Helen of Wales. Her beauty wasn't just admired, it was dangerous. It toppled loyalties, shattered alliances, and ignited war. Imagine this: a midnight raid, a husband held at sword point, children ripped from their beds, and a princess carried away into the shadows. Not once. Ferch Rhys was no passive figure. She lived at the center of betrayals and battles that shaped medieval Wales. Her life tangled with kings, knights, and invaders who all wanted to possess her. And here's the forbidden truth: every time men thought they had claimed her, Nest turned captivity into influence, scandal into survival, and chaos into power. They wanted her silenced, forgotten, erased from the songs. But her story is still here, burning, scandalous, unforgettable. And what unfolded after her abduction was not just a crime of passion, it was the spark of a war that reshaped Wales. The story of Princess Nest begins long before the raid that earned her the name Helen of Wales. To understand her fate, you have to picture Wales at the turn of the 12th century, a land of crags, forests, and fortresses, where rival lords and foreign invaders drew their maps with blood. It was a fractured country, half independent, half crushed under Norman expansion. And its daughters were caught in the storm of politics and survival. Nest was born into royalty. Her father, Rhys ap Chodwr, was the last independent king of Deheubarth in South Wales. He was a ruler with fire in his veins, one who held his lands against rivals as long as he could, but the Normans were pressing, relentless, their castles sprouting across the hills like iron weeds. When Rhys fell in battle in 1093, Nest's life, barely begun, was already turned upside down. The kingdom collapsed. The Normans moved in, and the princess, who should have grown up a queen-in-waiting, became instead a political pawn. She was still a girl when the Normans took her into their custody. Some say she was given as a hostage, others that she was a ward, raised among the very men who had crushed her father. Imagine her young, observant, in a foreign household, watching her enemies eat at her table and smile with polished courtesy. She learned quickly what survival meant: to be silent when silence was safest, to charm when charm was needed, and above all, to remember who she was, even when others tried to rewrite her fate. And yet, fate had plans for her. Nest grew into a woman of striking beauty, so much so that bards compared her to Helen of Troy, and like that ancient queen, her beauty would become both her weapon and her curse. The first man of note to claim her was none other than Henry, the son of William the Conqueror. Before he was king, before the crown sat on his head, Henry looked at the Welsh princess and desired her. Whether she was his mistress by choice or by force, the chronicles do not agree, but what they agree on is this: she bore him a son. Think about the danger of that. A Welsh princess carrying the child of a Norman prince. Nest walked a knife's edge between scandal and survival, between disgrace and protection. For some women, that would have been the end of their story, swallowed up by shame or forgotten in the footnotes of kings. But not Nest. She carried the child, raised him, and somehow turned this dangerous liaison into a card she could play later. Henry, once he became King Henry I of England, did not forget her. He arranged her marriage to Gerald of Windsor. a Norman castellan tasked with holding Pembroke Castle in Wales. To Henry, it was a neat solution: bind the Welsh princess to a Norman lord, tie bloodlines and loyalties together, and keep the peace. To Nest, it was another twist in the web of power she was forced to navigate. Gerald was no romantic suitor. He was a soldier, pragmatic and loyal to the king. Their marriage was not love, but it was survival. And in that survival, Nest bore him several children, binding her future more tightly to the Norman cause. But Nest was never truly safe. Her beauty, her lineage, her very existence was like a torch in a dry forest. Sparks flew wherever she went. And one night, those sparks lit a blaze that would set Wales aflame. It was Owain ap Cadwan, a Welsh prince of Powys, who struck the match. Owain had heard the tales of Nest's beauty. He had perhaps even seen her once, across a hall, across a battlefield. And what burned in him was not just desire, it was obsession. To possess Nest was to possess a living symbol of Wales itself, the daughter of Rhys ap Chudwar, the princess stolen by Normans and bound to one of their lords. So Owain gathered his men. He planned a raid bold enough to echo through the hills for generations. By torchlight, under the cold stars of Wales, he stormed Gerald's castle. Swords clashed, walls shook, and Nest, roused from sleep, must have felt her heart hammer as shouts filled the night. Gerald fought, but Owain's men overpowered him. And then came the act that would brand Nest forever as the Helen of Wales. Owain. Gerald was left humiliated, his children scattered in the chaos, his household burning. Nest, the princess who had been pawn, mistress, and wife, was now captive once again, this time in the arms of a Welsh prince who claimed her as his prize. But here's the secret the chronicles rarely tell you. Nest was never only a victim. Even in this abduction, even as she was carried into the night, she was calculating, surviving, shaping what would come next. And what came next was war. The abduction of Princess Nest was not just a scandal. It was the spark that set Wales ablaze, igniting battles between Normans and Welsh, between rival princes, between passion and politics. Nest, against her will, yet always at the center, became the flame around which men killed and kingdoms shifted. And as the smoke of that first raid cleared, one thing was certain: the story of ferch Rhys was only just beginning. The night Owain ap Cadwan dragged Princess Nest from her chamber at Sennerth Beacon, what followed was chaos. The kind of chaos that can topple castles and redraw borders. Nest's abduction was no private scandal. It was a spark in a powder keg, and Wales was the barrel. Picture the dawn after the raid. Smoke still curled from the burned timbers of Gerald of Windsor's stronghold. Soldiers picked through ashes, and women wept for the dead. Gerald himself stood battered and shamed, his wife taken, his children scattered, his honor gutted. For a Norman lord, humiliation was as dangerous as defeat. To lose one's fortress was bad enough. To lose one's wife to a Welsh raider, it was unbearable. And so Gerald rode hard to King Henry, carrying his grievance like a wound that would not close. Henry's court bristled at the tale. This was more than an insult to Gerald. It was an insult to the crown itself. Princess Nest was no ordinary woman. She was Henry's former mistress, the mother of his son, the carefully placed bride meant to keep a fragile peace in Wales. For Owain to seize her was to strike directly at the king's authority. Henry's pride, like Gerald's, could not endure it. War was inevitable. Meanwhile, Nest was deep in the clutches of Owain. The chronicles differ on how she was treated. Some paint Owain as a reckless prince, blinded by lust, who took what he wanted without thought for consequence. Others hint at something more complicated, that Nest, ever the survivor, adapted to her new captivity with the same sharp intelligence that had carried her through every twist of fate so far. Did she plead with Owain, warning him of the king's wrath? Did she play for time, soothing his pride, while looking for a way to protect her children? We cannot know. What we do know is that Nest had a gift for turning circumstance into survival. Owain, however, had no such gift. His raid had set all of Wales aflame. Neighboring lords, both Norman and Welsh, now circled him like wolves, some baying for vengeance, others scenting opportunity. To hold Nest was to hold fire in bare hands, glorious in its light, but sure to burn, and burn it did. Henry ordered retaliation, sending forces into Wales to punish Owain and his father, Cadwan ap. Castles were stormed, villages ravaged, blood spilled in rivers. Owain was forced to flee, carrying Nest with him as he sought refuge among allies. But allies are fickle when kings rage, and soon Owain found himself isolated, hunted like a stag across the hills and valleys. All the while, Nest endured. The daughter of Rhys ap Chawdwr had been born into fire. She knew how to walk through smoke. The chronicles tell us she bore children to multiple men across her life, Norman and Welsh alike, and each child became a thread she wove into the fabric of her survival. To some, this made her scandalous, a woman judged by the standards of men who feared her influence. But to Nest, each child was legacy insurance, the living proof that she could never be erased from the story of Wales. At last, Owain's reckless passion collapsed under the weight of politics. Pursued on all sides, he was forced to release Ness. Some say she escaped with her children, others that she was ransomed back. But what matters is this: Ness returned to Gerald, scarred but unbroken. Her abduction had humiliated her husband, but her return cemented her legend. She was no longer merely the daughter of a fallen king or the wife of a Norman castellan. She was the woman who had sparked a war. Gerald rebuilt his power, holding Pembroke once more, but the shadow of Owain's raid never left them. And Nest. She continued to move through the dangerous game of Welsh politics with the same resilience that had always defined her. Her beauty remained her curse and her weapon, her lineage both a burden and a shield. But the world had changed around her. The raid had shattered any illusion of peace between Norman and Welsh. It had exposed the fault lines of power, the fragile balance that kings and lords had tried to maintain. And in the heart of that fracture stood Nest, living proof that one woman's fate could ignite kingdoms. Her story was far from over, for Owain was not finished with her, nor were the lords of Wales finished with the bloodline she carried. Betrayals, alliances, and fresh abductions would follow, each one carving her deeper into the chronicles. And as the years passed, people began to whisper her name with awe and fear. Ferch Rhys, the Helen of Wales, the woman men fought for, killed for, and died for, the woman who turned captivity into legacy, But legacies are not without cost. For Nest, every choice, every survival, left scars on her children, on the land itself. And as her story wound deeper into the heart of Welsh resistance and Norman ambition, the lines between victim, survivor, and strategist blurred until no one could quite say which she truly was. One thing, however, was certain: she would never be forgotten. When Nest was finally restored to Gerald of Windsor, it might have seemed to outsiders as though her story had reached a close. She had endured captivity, survived Owen's reckless obsession, and returned to her household. But for a woman like Nest, princess, mistress, wife, and captive, all in one lifetime, the end of one chapter was only the beginning of another. For while castles could be rebuilt and peace treaties signed, the echoes of her abduction lingered in every corridor and whispered through every hall. Imagine her walking again through Pembroke's fortified walls, the very place where Owain's torchlight once danced across stone. Every face she met carried memory. Soldiers who had failed to protect her looked away. Courtiers judged her in silence, weighing questions they dared not speak. Had she gone willingly? Did she resist? Did she conspire? For women in her age, blame was often heavier than chains. But Nest was not a woman who bowed beneath blame. She carried herself with the same unshakable dignity she had inherited from her father, Rhys ap Chotwer, the last king of Deheubarth. Gerald, pragmatic as ever, did what men in power always do. He rebuilt. Fortifications rose stronger, garrisons grew larger, alliances were tightened with iron bands. But though his hands commanded soldiers, he could never quite command the legend of his wife. Nest had become larger than life. She was no longer simply a Norman castellan's wife. She was the woman at the center of Wales's storm, the Helen whose beauty and bloodline drove men to risk everything. And here is where the chronicles sharpen their knives. Nest, they say, bore many children to Gerald, anchoring her bloodline to the Norman grip on Pembroke. But whispers spread whispers that she bore children to other men as well. Some say she was pursued by Norman knights eager for the favor of a woman whose beauty rivaled myth. Others claim that Welsh lords, too, sought her, believing that to share her bed was to grasp at legitimacy, to claim a trace of the royal blood of Deheubarth. It is difficult, across the centuries, to separate truth from rumor. Medieval chroniclers delighted in scandal, especially when it came to powerful women. But what cannot be denied is this: Nest's children were many, and through them her blood spread across both Norman and Welsh houses. Her sons and daughters would grow to play crucial roles in the tangled politics of the Marches. Their loyalties split, their ambitions fierce. In this way, Nest's legacy seeped into the veins of Wales itself, binding friend and foe alike with her lineage. But Nest was more than a mother. She was a strategist. She had lived too long in the shadow of conquest, too long as a pawn in games she could not control, not to learn how to play in return. Each relationship, whether forced or chosen, whether whispered scandal or formal alliance, became another thread she wove into her tapestry of survival. She made herself indispensable, not just as a beauty, not just as a prize, but as a matriarch, a living symbol of continuity in a land fractured by war. And yet, the ghosts of her past never slept. Owain ap Cadwan still lived, still lurked on the edge of the story, like a wolf who refuses to leave the flock alone. Though his abduction of Nest had shattered his fortunes, he did not vanish. From time to time, his name surfaced again, attached to raids, feuds, and betrayals. For Ness, the knowledge that her captor still walked the same earth must have been a shadow always behind her shoulder. Meanwhile, King Henry watched with a calculating eye. Nest had once been his mistress, the mother of his illegitimate son. He had placed her in Gerald's hands to keep her close, to secure her loyalty. But Henry never forgot his debts, nor the tools at his disposal. Through Ness, he had influence in Pembroke, in Deheubarth, in every corner of Wales where her blood ran, and Henry, ever the spider in his web, never hesitated to pull on threads when it suited him. It is easy to imagine Nest sitting in her chambers at twilight, her children gathered around her, the torches flickering on stone walls. Outside, the winds of Wales howled across the hills, carrying with them the cries of battle, the chants of bards, the echoes of raids yet to come. She would have known, with the clarity of one who had already survived so much, that peace was always temporary, that the next storm was already forming beyond the horizon, and so it was. Gerald's position remained precarious, balanced between Norman overlords and Welsh resistance. Every feast could be followed by a skirmish, every alliance by a betrayal. Nest's role in all of this was not passive. She counseled, she remembered, she soothed, she bound. Her beauty might have been the spark, but her mind was the flame that kept her household alive. Yet her life was not without bitterness. For all her resilience, she could not escape the way men used her name as a weapon. Some called her temptress, blaming her for the violence her beauty inspired. Others called her victim, erasing her agency in a world where survival required cunning as much as strength. But those who knew her truly knew her must have seen what the chronicles obscure: a woman who endured, who adapted, who turned every captivity into a kind of power. By the time Gerald's star began to fade, Nest's children were grown, their futures already tangled with Wales's destiny. Some served the Norman crown, others clung to their Welsh heritage, still others straddled the dangerous line between. Through them, Nest's influence multiplied. She had become the matriarch of a generation, her bloodline flowing through the veins of knights, princes, and rebels alike. And still the legend grew. In taverns and halls, men whispered her name as though it were both blessing and curse. The Helen of Wales, the woman for whom men had burned castles, slain rivals, and defied kings. A woman who could not be contained, no matter how many times the world tried to bind her. But legends are dangerous things. They have a way of taking flesh and turning it into symbol. And as Nest grew older, as her beauty softened into memory and her wisdom sharpened into steel, she must have realized that her life was no longer entirely her own. She belonged to the story now, to the whispers and the songs, to the history that would not let her rest, and the story was not finished. More betrayals waited, more storms gathered, and Nest, as always, would find herself at the center, a flame in the darkness, a name that could never be ignored. By the time Princess Nest reached her later years, her life had already been marked by more upheaval than most dynasties could endure in a century. She had been daughter of a fallen king, mistress of a Norman prince turned king, wife of a castle lord, captive of a Welsh prince. and mother to a brood of children who straddled the razor's edge between conqueror and conquered. Yet, in those twilight decades, Nest's story did not grow quiet. Instead, it deepened. Returned to after Owain's abduction had changed. Its towers stood higher, its garrison stronger, but its heart was haunted by memory. Gerald of Windsor grew older, heavier with the burdens of rule, and though he still commanded respect, his hold on power was less absolute. The Marches, that volatile borderland between Norman steel and Welsh spirit, were in constant flux. Alliances shifted like sand dunes in the coastal winds. Every noble family sought advantage. Every prince eyed his neighbor's lands with suspicion, and every spark threatened to become fire. Nest, in this world, was both anchor and lightning rod. Her children had grown, scattering like seeds across the soil of Wales and beyond. And each child carried not only her blood, but also her complicated legacy, a mix of Norman loyalty and Welsh defiance. Her sons, with Gerald William, Maurice, David, and others, were knights and lords, bound to defend their father's castles, but forever carrying the weight of their mother's royal Welsh heritage. Her illegitimate son by King Henry Fitzhenry. Her daughters were no less influential, married into noble families, where they became conduits of Nest's lineage into new strongholds. The chronicles paint Nest's later years as quieter, but the truth whispers through the cracks. Her name still surfaced in disputes, her bloodline still cited in claims to land and loyalty, and always behind these disputes her shadow lingered. She was no longer the captive dragged from her bed, no longer the scandalous mistress whose beauty drove men to ruin. She had become something even more formidable. Owain ap Cadwan, her captor, had not vanished from the stage, though his fortunes had collapsed after the infamous raid. His name carried with it the memory of her abduction, the humiliation of Gerald, the war that followed. And even years later, people still whispered, was Nest's abduction a crime of lust or a calculated strike at Norman power? Did Owain love her, or merely wish to claim her as a symbol of Welsh pride? For Nest herself, those questions must have cut like old wounds reopened, impossible to heal. But perhaps the deepest wounds came not from captors or kings, but from her own blood. For her children, raised in the shadow of both Norman and Welsh heritage, often found themselves on opposite sides of conflict. Some allied with Norman lords, defending castles against Welsh rebels. Others leaned toward their mother's kin, lending their swords to causes that sought to reclaim the independence of Wales. Brothers clashed with brothers, cousins with cousins, all tied by the blood that flowed from Nest, yet divided by the world that blood had bound them to dot in this way. Nest's life became a mirror of Wales itself, land torn between foreign conquest and native resistance, between submission and defiance, between survival and pride. Just as Wales could not decide whether to yield or to fight, Nest's lineage could not decide whether to stand with the Normans or the Welsh, and so her family became both bridge and battlefield, embodying the contradictions of an age where identity was never simple and loyalty was never absolute. Still, Nest endured. She was no longer young, but she carried herself with the same quiet fire she always had. Those who came before, her petitioners, knights, even her own children knew that behind her beauty had always been a mind sharpened by survival. She counseled with wisdom born of pain, urging prudence where others saw only vengeance, urging patience where others saw only pride, and in this she became more than matriarch. She became legend. Bards sang of her still, though the songs grew blurred between truth and myth. Some called her the Helen of Wales outright, comparing her to the woman whose abduction launched 1,000 ships. Others whispered darker tales, painting her as a temptress who lured men to their ruin. Still others praised her as a symbol of Welsh resilience, a daughter of Rhys who endured captivity, scandal, and war, yet lived to see her children grown and her name unforgotten. And here lies the paradox of Nest's later years. She was at once flesh and story, mother and myth, victim and survivor. To walk in her chambers was to meet a woman of flesh and voice, advising her sons, comforting her daughters, lighting lamps against the long nights. To walk in the halls beyond was to hear her name as symbol, invoked in politics and poetry alike. Few women in medieval Wales could wield such power, not through armies, not through crowns, but through memory itself. As age settled on her shoulders, Ness must have wondered how she would be remembered. Would her name be tied forever to Owen's raid, her identity bound to the night she was carried from her chamber? Or would she be remembered as the mother of dynasties, the woman who linked Norman and Welsh blood, the matriarch whose children shaped the fate of the marches? The truth is, she became both. And in that duality lies the reason her story survived when so many others were forgotten. She was at once the scandal and the solution, the flame and the ashes, the captive and the queen in all but name. By the time Gerald of Windsor passed from the stage, Nest had already secured her legacy. Her children carried her blood into castles and courts across Wales. Her name was etched into charters, whispered in claims, sung in verses. She had outlived the men who had tried to possess her. Owain was dead, slain by rivals. Gerald, too, was gone. King Henry himself had passed into memory. But Nest endured, a living bridge between generations. And as the sun set on her life, perhaps she stood once more on the battlements of Pembroke, looking out across the rolling hills and the restless sea. She had been captive and queen, pawn and matriarch, forgotten and unforgettable. And in that moment, perhaps she knew that her story would never die, because ferch Rhys was no ordinary woman. She was the Helen of Wales, the flame who lit a war, the mother who bound to worlds, the legend who proved that even in captivity, a woman could shape the fate of nations. The twilight of ferch Rhys's life was not quiet, nor could it have been. A woman whose beauty had been compared to Helen of Troy, whose abduction had sparked war, and whose children carried both Norman and Welsh blood, could never fade gently into obscurity. Even as age silvered her hair and time softened the sharpness of her face, her presence remained magnetic. To speak her name was to summon both scandal and reverence. To remember her was to remember the turbulence of Wales itself in the 12th century. By the time Nest grew old, the political landscape had shifted yet again. Norman fortresses rose higher on Welsh soil. Their stone keeps pressing like iron thumbs against the land. The princes of Wales resisted, still, fiercely, desperately, clinging to their fragmented kingdoms with the stubborn pride of mountains, refusing to bow to the sea. And there, In the borderlands, where Norman and Welsh met, married, and murdered one another, Nest's bloodline thrived. Her children had become the makers of history in their own right. William Fitzgerald, Maurice Davidsons, who defended Norman castles, governed marcher lordships, and enforced the king's will in hostile territory. Henry Fitzhenry, her son by King Henry, carried the prestige of royal blood, serving as a reminder that Nest had once lain in the bed of England's most powerful man. Her daughters, too, had become conduits of alliance, marrying into noble families whose loyalties stretched across both sides of the border. But this was not a simple legacy. Her children, like Wales itself, were divided. Some clung to Norman loyalties, reinforcing the foreign grip on the land. Others remembered their mother's father, Rhys, ap Chadwr, the last king of Deheubarth, and leaned toward Welsh causes. Blood met blood on the battlefield, brothers and cousins crossing swords under banners that traced back to the same mother. To Nest, the pain of this must have been deep. Her womb had borne both the conqueror and the conquered. Her blood had become both the sword and the shield. And yet, this was her triumph as much as her tragedy. For Nest had ensured that her lineage could not be erased. She had been pawn and prize, mistress and captive, but through her children she became inescapable. To kill the Welsh was to kill her blood. To rule the Normans was to rely on her descendants. She had bound herself to the destiny of the land in a way that no conqueror could undo. As the years wore on, Nest withdrew somewhat from the storm of politics. She was no longer the young beauty who drew men like moths to flame, nor the captive whose abduction could spark a war. She had become something greater, the matriarch whose counsel was sought in private, whose wisdom carried weight not because of a crown, but because of scars. Her sons visited her with news of sieges and treaties. Her daughters carried to her the gossip of courts and the births of grandchildren. Nest listened, remembered, advised. She was not queen in name, but she was queen in all but power, and still the songs spread. Bards carried her story from hall to hall, shaping it, twisting it, exalting and condemning her in equal measure. Some sang of her as a victim, torn again and again from safety, her beauty, her curse. Others praised her as a survivor, a woman who turned every captivity into influence, every scandal into endurance. Still others whispered darker tales, painting her as a temptress whose charms brought ruin on men and kingdoms alike. But all agreed on one thing: she could not be ignored. It was in these later years that the title Helen of Wales became fixed to her name. Like Helen of Troy, Nest had been carried off against her will, her abduction igniting battles that reshaped nations. Like Helen, she was both blamed and celebrated, both condemned and immortalized. And like Helen, she would live on long after her body returned to the earth. When death finally came for Nest, it came quietly. The chronicles do not record the details, whether she died in Pembroke, in one of her son's halls, or in the quiet of a convent, is uncertain. What they do record is her absence and the power vacuum it left. For though Nest had not ruled as queen, her presence had been a form of rule all its own. Without her, Wales lost not just a woman, but a living bridge between past and present, between Norman and Welsh, between conquest and resistance. In the aftermath, her legend only grew. Her children and grandchildren continued to shape the destiny of Wales for generations. Through them, Nest's blood reached into the highest circles of the marcher lords, into Irish conquests, even into the Plantagenet dynasty itself. Her lineage became one of the foundations of Anglo-Norman power in the British Isles, and yet, through her father's blood, it also carried the memory of a free Welsh kingdom, a memory that never fully died. The bards were right. Nest was Helen of Wales, but she was also more. She was proof that women, even in an age where men held crowns and swords, could shape history not only through beauty, but through survival, resilience, and the quiet power of legacy. She turned captivity into continuity, scandal into dynasty. She showed that the role forced upon her in games of power could be subverted into something greater centuries later. When chroniclers inked her name into their manuscripts, they did so with fascination. Some condemned her as the root of discord, the spark of bloodshed. Others elevated her as a figure of tragic nobility. But none erased her. For Nest's story, once ignited, could not be extinguished, and perhaps that is the truest testament to her life. Men fought over her, yes. Castles burned for her, yes. Songs scandalized her, yes. But in the end, she endured them all. When Owain dragged her into the night, when Gerald rebuilt his pride, when Henry claimed her as mistress, when the bards sang her name in judgment, Nest endured. And through her endurance, she became unforgettable. So imagine her one final time not as the frightened girl carried from her chamber, nor as the young mistress of a king, nor even as the matriarch surrounded by sons and daughters. Imagine her instead as she must have seen herself in her last years, standing in the twilight. The Welsh hills stretched out before her, the sea whispering beyond, her children's laughter and quarrels echoing in her ears. A woman scarred, a woman exalted, a woman remembered, a woman who, like Helen before her, shaped history not by ruling it, but by surviving it. Ferch Rhys, the Helen of Wales, the flame that never went out.